I just wanted to drink in peace until the Alpha King's mother made a shocking offer. The Solstice Ballroom smelled of polished wood, waxed candelabras, and a half-dozen expensive colognes rubbing shoulders until they snarled. For someone who read for pleasure in rooms that smelled like old paper and tea, it was a war zone. Jude tucked his face into his collar and pretended to be a statue among the marble pillars, letting the crowd move around him like wind. He had a patch tucked behind his ear, a thin oval of borrowed technology that dulled the edges of his scent, a gray place between his skin and the world that made him, in practice, unreadable. That unreadability had been a small, precise kind of safety. As an Omega from a baronial family that had eaten more debt than grain for 3 generations, Jude had learned to survive by being small. He studied. He kept his mouth full of quotations and his hands full of books. He did not attract attention. He did not carry a scent that needed policing. The patch meant he could stand in a room with alphas and not feel like a rabbit. It did not mean, as he would discover, that he could hide entirely. Queen Beatrice found him because she had eyes that missed nothing. She moved through the room like a knife through silk, sharp, efficient, and garnished with the kind of imperious warmth that could be weaponized. She had watched him hesitate at the punch bowl and had seen the way he folded his fingers around the rim of his glass as if it were paper to be read. That was all she needed. "Come," she said, and when Jude flinched, she reached out and took his elbow as though he were a guest she had a right to pilot. "Come, if you are the sort of person who can sit still in a crowd, we might use you." He had time, a heartbeat, to analyze the sentence like a line of classical poetry and deduce the blunt truth beneath it. The Queen was not being charitable, she was decuting. She supposed deputations came with less fanfare than death and more ribbon than consequence, though the courtiers around them were composed enough to pretend not to hear. Across the room, the Orsian delegation landed like a threat in crisp uniforms and colder eyes. Their alpha, tall, too frankly armed, and smelling faintly of ocean and old iron, was introduced as Lord Stephen. Or's ships came with drums in the last fall harvest. They came with clauses in their speeches, and with men who knew how to make a country's ledger look like an open throat. Their demand was simple and ugly: grain debt owed, and marriage to secure repayment. Beatrice had already been considering chess positions on a scale that made ordinary apprehension look like child's play. She stepped between Jude and the Orsian Alpha, and, with the smooth cruelty of someone accustomed to rearranging people like chess pieces, announced a plan out loud, as if the plan itself would be the thing that spared them. "This one," she said, tapping Jude with a manicured nail so that the crowd took notice, "will do as a placeholder." The ballroom recalibrated. A placeholder was a phrase that carried countless unspoken liabilities and a smell of desperation. Jude stared at the Queen as if she had misread him. He had not. Beatrice's smile folded like someone opening a file. "You will make him our public intended," she said. 90 days, no claims, no binding. A performance. You will buy us time." There was a kind of silence then that had nothing to do with sound, only with the sudden rearrangement of possibilities. People who had been drinking smiled more carefully. A cluster of ministers leaned in to exchange notes with fingers that trembled imperceptibly. The Orsian Alpha blinked, calculations passing across his face like clouds. Jude felt every eye for 2 beats too many. His pulse, practiced at being small, began an anxious staccato. He thought about his father's debts, the ledger folded and worn in the back of their little household, about Toby, the way Jude told himself he will be fine, and worried it was not true. He thought about how his books paid for tutoring, and tutoring kept food on their table in thin months. "You mean," Jude managed. He was not quick at social maneuvering. A life of books lent a slowness to his social reflexes, a habit of pausing for punctuation that did not do well when Queen Beatrice was on the clock. "A public engagement," Beatrice finished for him. "A display, a legal facade, not a binding match. You will play the part of someone the king might choose. The Ors will not demand anything more while our betrothal is in place. 90 days, you remain free." The queen's eyes glittered. There was a calculation that disguised itself as charity. Time was currency in a land where grain and ships could be used as instruments of war. If Beatrice could keep the Orsian Alpha satiated for 90 days, Alan could find a way to maneuver funds, to sweeten treaties, to make the ledger look like something that would not swallow the kingdom whole. "And what do you want in return?" Jude asked. It was not brave. It was a lecturer asking for a syllabus. He had to know the terms. Beatrice's laugh was sharp as a document edge. "You will be protected. You will be housed. You will be fed. Your name will be allowed to shine for as long as the story requires. In return, you will walk the floor with the king, be seen in public, make a show of being his chosen." It was a terrible exchange for someone who had spent their life avoiding being seen. It was also, in its own crude arithmetic, a bargain Jude could understand. Safety for exposure. Time bought with a lie, yes, but a lie in service of the family ledger, of a brother who wore his shoes until they folded, of small human needs. He considered the patch behind his ear as if it were an apostate blessing. "You have a roof, Jude," Beatrice said suddenly, and the softness in her tone was a tool. "And you have a mind. The king might use both. We will keep the Ors at bay." Alan, when he was finally dragged into the center of things, as if he were a reluctant statue, regarded Jude with the patient, cool scrutiny of a predator that had learned to catalog prey by temperament. He was tall and lit as if carved from cedar. His scent threaded through the room like smoke wrapped in sandalwood. Jude felt a tug at his ribs that had nothing to do with the patch, the raw biological answer to a king's proximity, the small, unavoidable fact of being an Omega in a room full of alphas. Alan gave no speech. He barely needed to. The court swayed on the axis of the Queen's declaration, and the king's consent was the final lever. He inclined his head as if measuring the weight of the thing Beatrice had put on the table. "If he plays his part," Alan said, his voice low and even, "we will all be praised for our foresight." There was no warmth in the words, but there was also no dismissal. He regarded Jude with something that was all ruler and calculation, an assessment of how useful this man would be. It would be pragmatic, and that was as much as Jude could ask for, given the alternative. They arranged a document with more ink than Jude had seen in his life, a contract with the kind of grammar that pretended certainty and hid contingency. He read because he was a scholar, and because refusing to read would be admitting that he trusted political trust to strangers. The clauses were practical and sharp. Public appearances, rehearsed affection, a non-binding clause that made the arrangement legally a performance, conditions of safe conduct for Jude and his household. There was a section that compensated his family and guaranteed protection for his brother Toby in the event of any reprisals. There was a line that confessed this was only a stopgap. There was a line that made clear the Orsian demand would be entertained so long as the display continued. There was also a footnote that, almost apologetically, suggested that the patch he wore would complicate the performance. "Removal of scent inhibitors is not required," the lawyer wrote in polite script.
But public believability may require adjustment at the king's discretion. Jude wanted to fold the paper in thirds and place it in his jacket like an apology. He wanted to run. He also wanted selfishly and plainly his brother's ledger to stop bleeding. He had spent years small-handed and careful so that someone else could be big-handed and careless. The bargain tilted the scales. He signed. The signature was a tremor. Beatrice's eyes were pleased and cold. Alan's hand steadied the paper. A cluster of courtiers applauded with the practiced enthusiasm of people who applaud because their applause will be judged later.
The Orzayan Alpha watched with a lawman's face, an expression that suggested he had been offered something he could live with but would remember. After the contract was signed, Beatrice clapped him on the back with a force that felt like a verdict. "Good," she said. "Begin now. The king will instruct." Jude had been thinking of a quiet wine and the sanctity of 2 hours alone with a book. Instead, he was swept along a current of ministers and footmen up to a suite in the palace, the size of the inn where he had learned to read. The tapestries there smelled of months of incense, the kind that could not be erased by the patch. It was a beautiful room, designed to make people feel their smallness and wealthy enough to be cruel. Jude pressed his palm to the table as if to feel whether the wood was real. The first thing Alan instructed him to do in private was smaller than a decree and yet heavier than most of the laws Jude had ever read. "You will not hide your scent when you are with me," Alan said, blunt as a report. The king's insistence was not spiteful but practical. "If you are to be my public intended, and I am to present you as credible, the court and the oars must be able to sense you. Patches are a lie." Jude, who had spent his life curating the quiet auditorium of his own presence, felt the floor tilt at the suggestion. He imagined his small scent on public display, like a sentence read aloud in a courtroom. It was terrifying. "It's not required by the contract," Jude said, too fast, feeling his scholar's diction turn into a plea. "The paper is my mother's paper," Alan interrupted. "She offered you. I consented because she crafted the terms, but this is my person's choice. I will not have someone I present as mine hidden from the court by a trick." There was a kind of mercy in that was colder than any cruelty Jude had ever imagined. Alan's manner implied not malice, but necessity. He was a man who expected the laws of the world to be obeyed. Jude understood the logic. If the oars could pass a hand over the boy's hair and find nothing, suspicion would bloom into another kind of danger. But logic was one thing, and the scraped-out place behind his ear was another. He felt exposed in a way he did not like. "You can refuse," Alan added, almost as an afterthought, and Jude, for all his analysis, heard the undercurrent. Refusal would make the Orzayan Alpha smell blood in the water. It would make his small family vulnerable. It would, in other words, be dangerous. Jude thought of Toby waking up hungry next week if the payments stopped. He thought of his father's stooped back and the way poverty had taught them to be patient, like a thin, sharp animal. He took the patch between 2 fingers and, for the first time in years, peeled it away. The air hit him like a book opened in public.
He smelled himself, ash and ink and a trace of lemon soap, and he smelled faintly the fragrance of the palace, incense, candle wax, the musk of servants' labor. For a moment he felt dizzy, like a man lifting his head too fast. Alan watched him with a look that was not one of triumph, but of assessment. "Good," he said. "Good. Now wear this." He took from a tray a small strip of cloth infused with a faint, clean scent, sandalwood and something almost like smoke. He did not force it. He pressed it into Jude's palm the way one might hand over a tool. "It is the king's public scent," Alan said. "You will wear it when we appear together. It will make you believable without exposing you to uncontrolled marking." It was a starter, and Jude accepted it because he was being practical in the same way the Queen was practical, and because he did not know how to be anything else in a room of rulers. The small cloth on his skin, smelling of smoke and cedar, felt like a mask and a promise at once. Their first practice in public performance was awkward in ways that were both comical and quietly revealing. Alan's hand on his back as they walked the palace galleries was not gentle. Kings were not always gentle, but it was precise, like the hand of someone teaching a student a complicated card trick. Jude found himself leaning into the steadiness because public eyes were hungry for spectacle, and because Alan's bulk at his back calmed something in him. Smile when a diplomat speaks, and Jude practiced as if learning lines. Incline your head when asked a question. Laugh at my jokes, even when they are small. If they see us easy, they will not poke. Jude kept count of the number of times he was told to relax. He thought of relaxation as a muscle he had never exercised. The king's palm at his back was a brace. Between rehearsals, and in moments when the palace let down its face for a breath, Jude retreated to books left in the sitting room, old political treatises that smelled of dust and argument. He read as if he could immune himself with knowledge. But the palace was not a library, and sooner or later he was pulled back into the orbit of court. Alan, during the quiet of those days, revealed flashes of himself that did not belong to the public myth of a king. In the privacy of a suite almond-lighted and lined with maps, Alan could be less of the cedar-carved statue Jude had been introduced to, and more a man who kept his hands neat on paper, and who favored economy in his laughter. Once, when Alan asked a simple question about a clause in the Orsian demand, Alan answered in a way that sketched the man beneath the crown. The Ors are not cruel without reason. They are practical in their cruelty. If they can turn a nation with contracts, they will. My mother knows that. She understands what must be cajoled and what must be fought. That last phrase, what must be cajoled and what must be fought, stayed with Jude. He had been told his whole life to fight in the small ways, a corrected footnote here, a rebuke of a greedy merchant there. This was different. It required a different kind of courage, the kind that moved bodies into public view for political ends. The first public event where Jude's role had teeth was a small council that Beatrice called under the pretense of hospitality and the real purpose of testing his usefulness. They were given a draft of an accord, pages of legalese meant to bind the Orsian fleet away from the kingdom's merchant lanes, and Jude, to his own surprise, noticed a line that read like a trap. It allows merchant vessels to be inspected beyond our ports, Jude observed when he had the courage to speak up. The council had been arguing terms. They paused when he lifted a finger, as one might lift a marginal note. It was a minor clause in the throng of wording, but the implication was not minor. The clause could permit Orsian ships to claim a right to search, and searching under the right pretense could be used to park warships disguised as trade within the bays. He explained it as he would explain a page of poetry, line by line, with a demonstration. "You mean an unrestricted merchant vessel clause?" one of the ministers asked, brow furrowing. Jude nodded. He tasted the fear of being a child speaking in an adult room, but he found the logic he had always loved and used it like a blunt instrument. It would be a loophole. If someone could pass a warship as a merchant vessel, he said, they could be in our waters with the invasion clause effectively already in motion. Alan listened without interrupting. The king had the expression of a man who counted risk the way some people counted coins. When Jude finished, a quiet murmur ran through the room. One of the senior counselors, a man who had been the definition of gray in the court, thanked Jude in a manner that was cautious and sincere. Beatrice watched him like she was watching a harvest.
"You have a keen eye," she said. "Perhaps we were right to bring you in." It was a compliment that felt like currency. Jude, however, felt a hollowed-out satisfaction. He had wanted to be useful in ways that preserved his life's work, intellect for the sake of governance rather than spectacle. It was not heroism, not yet. It was a small act of policy that might, in the end, be counted as a saving move or be forgotten in the next scandal. Politics, he had learned, did not care for continuity. It cared for noise. There were intimacies forming that were not yet named as such. At night, Alan would leave him a note with a single line of instruction, a book to read, a map to examine, or a single line of kindness rendered in that peculiar royal tone that made the words feel like a private message sent in a room full of listeners. Once, the note said simply, "Keep your scarf."
When Jude found it, the king had left the room as if he had merely walked out for exercise, but Jude felt an odd warmth at the instruction. The scarf was thin and smelled faintly of Alan's smoked sandalwood. Jude folded it into his pocket like a rebellion. There was another odd private ritual, scent planning. It was not the mating mark or the bite. It was smaller, and for Jude, it felt like the first time he had been asked to remove a mask and then be applauded for the courage of revelation. In the king's study, with curtains drawn against the winter sun, Alan showed him how to set the public scent without surrendering himself. "This strip," Alan said, offering the sandalwood square again, "is not meant to make you mine. It is meant to make you believable. You will decide how much of yourself you allow into the room." Jude learned to set the strip along his collarbone, to let it hover above his pulse. The ceremony was precise, a domestic choreography that felt stranger than any courtly ritual. Alan watched him with a concentration that bordered on reverence, and Jude, who had kept watch over ink and ledger for most of his life, found that attention unnerving and oddly intoxicating. In the weeks that followed, their performance tightened around them like a garment. They walked through public markets with hands set. They appeared at banquets where Beatrice would toast, like a woman who had negotiated mercy with sharpened teeth. Jude found himself performing in ways he had not realized he was capable of, smiling when he meant nothing, deflecting questions about his background with an easy line learned from a book, pretending to laugh when the king said something only half funny. It was a strange college, the court, education in posture and cruelty. The Orsian Alpha watched like a man who smelled bargains and tested their edges. There were letters and ships and small meetings where ministers insisted they had leverage, while Beatrice calculated the exact shape of the kingdom's teeth. Jude, whose world had once been footnotes and book spines, was learning to read another kind of text, the social ledger, where a man's smile could be debited and a glance credited. All the while, a quieter thing was happening. Inside the palace, in the suite with its heavy curtains and the quiet that comes from being in the center of power, Jude was feeling the strange hollow of being seen and not believed. The strip on his collarbone invited touch as much as it invited sight. Alan's palm on the small of his back reassured as much as it directed. There were moments when their rehearsed affection stumbled into something closer to real. Passing touches that lingered, late-night conversations that outlived their pretense. Jude kept a mental ledger of these events as if they were items to be recorded. He did this because it felt safer, because cataloging pain and pleasure as entries allowed him to keep his head.
He did not trust feelings yet. Feelings could be manipulated by a queen with a plan. He trusted the clarity of ink. And yet, the patch gone from behind his ear felt more consequential than any entry. When he slept, he dreamed of margins full of notes, of paper stacked like living things.
He dreamed, too, of sandalwood and smoke, and of a hand that smoothed his hair as if it were a delicate instrument. The dreams left him tired in the mornings, not from sex or scandal, but from the emotional exertion of pretending not to be terrified. The first significant slip in the performance happened at the Founders' Gala, a glittering event meant to celebrate the kingdom's myths and to reinforce the fiction of stability. There were lanterns, silk banners, and the low, watery music that courtiers used when they wanted to make strangers feel like family. Jude had practiced his smile until it was a muscle with its own memory. He had the sandalwood strip in place and his roll down. But nothing prepares a person for the moment when a thing you are meant to be echoes with a truth you were not expecting. Alan kissed him, light at first, in front of the assembled guests, a measured press of mouth that was supposed to be a flourish. Jude had been rehearsed for this. He had been taught to tilt his head the right way, to clutch at the illusion with both hands. And then something in this press of lips slipped. It was not a theatrical move. It was small and astonishing and wholly unedited. Alan's touch deepened as if someone had decided to color inside the darkest lines of a drawing. Jude felt, for the first time, the king as a private force rather than a public artifact. The kiss lasted the sort of long that rewrites a person, and then ended in a breath that was not entirely theirs both. Jude fled the ballroom as if heat could be escaped by distance. The crowd murmured. People who were fed on scandals traded them like sugar. He did not know yet whether this was a triumph or an abyss. He knew only that his chest felt like pages being turned too quickly. Back in his suite, alone with a cup of wine he did not want, but drank anyway, Jude tried to think in the neat lines that had always comforted him. Logic did not fit comfortably with hot, tangible reality. He catalogued sensations, the press of Alan's mouth, the weight of the royal palm, the small electric shock of being seen for reasons other than utility. He wrote nothing down because words felt too formal for the confusion. He was interrupted by a footfall and a soft knock. Alan entered as if he had merely come to check a document, and for a breath was the king returning to routine. Never one for needless sentiment, he sat opposite Jude and did not look away. "I think," said Alan, with a half-smile that did not reach all the way to his eyes, "I have been careless." There was in that admission the first hint of something that could be called vulnerability. Jude looked at him, feeling the small, incredulous flutter of someone who remembers the syllabus and wonders if the lecture is about to become a confessional. "You do not have to tell me this now," Jude managed, because there were social scripts for vulnerability, and he had only a hazy idea of the correct responses. "I do," said Alan, "because I cannot stand pretending I am less affected than I am, and because your being in danger is unacceptable to me." Jude, who had turned himself into a protector of small facts, was suddenly at a loss. "Danger?" he started. Alan's expression went hard at the edges, in the way that signaled both a king and a man. "The oars will test us. My mother bought us time, but they will press. They smell weakness as well as markets. If they find our engagement is hollow, they will not hesitate." Jude thought of the ship clause he had noticed in the council meeting and felt as though a new page had been added to a treatise he had been reading. "Then we are both actors," he said. Alan tilted his head. "Actors of a different sort. I need to know whether you will continue to act or whether you will choose otherwise." There was consent between them then, awkward and explicit. It was not cinematic.
It was the kind of conversation two people have when one has just altered the coordinates of their private life, and the other wants to make sure that his counterpart is not being coerced into sacrifice. I am not consenting out of ignorance. I am consenting because if I refuse my family, I know, Alan interrupted, softening in a way the king rarely allowed himself to be. Their arrangement was an emergency of its own kind, an engineered intimacy meant to hold back a tide. Jude made his choice in the name of something he feared to lose, and Alan recognized what that choice demanded. "You will not be used," Alan said, almost like a promise and almost like an order. Jude nodded because he had no language for the enormity of such a thing. They were two people performing an impossible play, and in the middle of it, both of them wanted the other to hold to a few small mercies. The following days were an odd mixture of public polish and private fracture stitching. They practiced strides for the parade. They rehearsed a handshake that suggested affection without intimacy. Beatrice circulated in the background like someone who had orchestrated a symphony and who enjoyed the sound of it. Jude was interviewed by a scribe who wanted to ask about his childhood and who made an entire paragraph about poverty sound romantic. He learned the taste of being watched and the rumble of being used. Still, with all the performance, Jude's scholar brain continued to provide real utility. He read minutes and found irregularities. He corrected phrasing that could affect port rights, and he provided, sometimes with a clarity that startled even himself, the ability to see the state's problems as problems of logic to be solved. It made him feel useful, which was a balm under all the anxiety. At night, when the palace quieted and the patch of sandalwood at his collarbone cooled, Jude would stare at the ceiling and count the ways he had been transformed. He had wanted to drink in peace when he arrived at the solstice ball, small comfort, a cup of wine and a book. Instead, he found himself in the junction of politics and intimacy, a hinge on which a kingdom might swing. He wondered whether the hinge could hold. An early morning letter arrived from his brother, Toby, written in a cramped hand that always made Jude smile. It was a small thing, news of a rooster, a joke about the baker, but it tethered him to the life he had left behind to step into pretending. He folded the letter and pressed it to his chest like a talisman. For all the sandaled steps and orchestrated affection, there was Toby's laugh to remind him that the person he was becoming was not only for a kingdom. It was, he told himself, for someone who would have to live with him long after the Queen's 90 days had evaporated. The first part of their bargain had been enacted. Jude had been publicized, the Orsians had accepted a public engagement as a stopgap, and the court breathed for a short time, as if time had been purchased. But the world kept moving. There were rumors in the market about soldiers disguised as merchants. There were articles from anonymous scribes wondering if the young man at Aelin's side was a dim-witted plaything or a savant. The press would make a meal of them given time, and time was what they did not have. Jude walked through the palace one afternoon and stopped at the gallery window to look at the river cutting the city like a vein. The sunlight turned the water to script. He fingered the sandalwood strip on his collarbone and felt the faint humid press where it met skin. He had sought anonymity and found visibility instead. He had wanted peace and found a war offset. A footman brought news that the Orsian envoy had sent another message, a suggestion that the kingdom make a more permanent arrangement. The letter smelled faintly of sea salt and negotiation. Jude read it and felt the old tightness in his chest that came from being a man forced into decisions. He thought of the way Beatrice had smiled when she introduced him as a placeholder. He thought of Aelin's hand on his back when they walked the gallery. He was not naive. He knew the price of being useful could be personal. He also knew that sometimes the personal was the only currency one had to spend. When he returned to his suite that evening, the king was waiting in the sitting room with a book open on his knee and the kind of half-smile that suggested both apology and calculation.
Jude folded into his place across from him, the practiced calm of an actor reasserting itself. "You look tired," Alan said. Jude made a small joke about the burdens of being photogenic, and the king's laugh was the sound of a thing easing. There was a gentleness in Alan in those moments that did not equate to softness. It equated, rather, to an economy of motion, as if every kindness was counted and spent deliberately. They spoke for a long time, and it was in that conversation Jude began to feel the shape of something neither entirely performance nor entirely plan. It was the fragile architecture of two people making a deal with an eye for safety and an eye for feeling. Neither of them had promised the other anything more than what they could give in the moment, and yet both of them were already tacking toward a future neither could predict. That night, as Jude prepared for bed, he pressed his palm to the collarbone where the sandalwood strip lay like a neat, aromatic bruise, and thought about the 69 days left on the Queen's 90-day plan, about the Orson Alpha at the table in the Solstice ballroom, and about the ledger at home. He had come to drink in peace. Instead, his cup had been refilled with court politics and a king's attention. It was a strange vintage. It might redeem his family. It might also break him. He slept with that taste in his mouth, sandalwood, smoke, and the faint tang of iron from a future that was not yet decided. The palace held its breath along with him, and beyond the heavy curtains, the city kept its secrets and its hunger. The next morning, the court would rehearse. The Orson envoy would be invited for tea and politeness, and Beatrice would count the minutes like coins. Jude would be expected to smile, as if he were a man who had never been afraid. He rose, and in a small, deliberate gesture, tightened the strip against his skin. If he was to be seen, he would be seen on his own terms. For now, that would have to be enough. The Or's envoy came with the smell of rain and iron threaded through their men's cloaks, as if the sea had been pressed into their collars. Lord Stephen arrived in a finer mood than at the Solstice ball, wearing a civility that was all calculation, careful smiles, tidy threats, a voice that never rose but always landed like a hammer. The kingdom had bought a sliver more breath. That breath had a price. They convened in the palace's morning room, a long space where sunlight made patterns on the carpet like ledger lines. Beatrice sat at the head with the wary comfort of someone who had been building bargains for half a lifetime. Alan stood beside her, the posture of a man who measured every angle of a room and decided which ones could be edged away without blood. Jude stood where courtiers had positioned him as if he were a piece of sculpture loaned to illustrate a point. The Orson opening words were oily. "We have no desire for war. We desire repayment and security." A marriage, public and recognized, would be tidy. Beatrice's reply was the thin one she always preferred, courteous and edged. A public commitment might serve. "We have displayed and intended. We are acting in good faith." Stephen tilted his head as if listening for something beneath her sentence, and then, with casual cruelty, suggested a refinement. A demonstration of bond would satisfy Or's custom, a proof required of those who would be called mates. The room held the taste of something like daylight and blood. It was a thing Jude had not expected to be asked to provide, the raw, visible proof of union that some cultures held sacred. He had been hired as a prop. This was a demand that cut him into usable pieces. Beatrice's jaw moved. For a heartbeat, Jude imagined she might refuse the bait. She did not. Her training for such negotiations had taught her to catalog acceptable harms. "We will consider a demonstration," she said slowly, as if buying air, "though our kingdom has its own laws and customs." "And our laws may bend," Alan said. His voice was low enough that only those close could hear the steel threaded in it. It was the kind of logic that made Jude feel small and responsible at once. Spare the people, and he must be a public instrument. He could see, with a scholar's horror, how a single sentence could be folded into a campaign. Later, when the emissaries had left and the council broke into hushed clusters, Jude sat for a long time in his room with Thomas, bringing a pot of tea that smelled faintly of lemon and soot. Toby's last letter lay folded in his coat pocket, like something that could be used to orient his hands. He could not imagine telling Toby about the morning's demand. He could not imagine describing what it would feel like to be asked to make his body the proof of politics. Word traveled quickly through the capital, not because the court shouted, but because courtiers whispered, and the city's scribes, ambitious, hungry, had ears for scandal. That afternoon, an anonymous sheet arrived in Jude's sitting room, rumor made into type. Someone in the press decided the court needed an explanation more sensational than thrift. The smear began small, a rumor about convenient engagements, then swelled into an accusation of mercenary affection. A pamphlet appeared suggesting that Jude had been placed for pay. The headlines called him a commodity with a sneer. Jude read the words as a man reads a ledger and felt each one like an entry charged to his name. The sting was shareable and immediate. Humiliation is a currency everyone understands. Alan came to him that evening without his kingly armor. He found Jude in the window seat, the river running like a margin of ink. The king stood in the doorway like a frame and watched him for a long time. "They will use anything to test us," he said finally.
If the Yours call for proof, they will find allies in our press who will twist a sacrifice into sale. Jude tried to map his feelings into sentences the way he mapped arguments. "Then we have to make our proof intelligible," he said, "not to them, to our people. If the truth is clear—" "The truth is rarely only one thing," Alan said. "Sometimes the truth is three things at once: what happened, why it happened, and what someone wants you to believe it meant." There was more in Alan's look than a ruler's practice. There was a man who had learned how stories could be weaponized, and who meant when he said "we" to include Jude within his small circumference. The next fortnight folded into a pattern of rehearsals, interviews, and policy meetings. Jude's days were thickened with duties he had not asked for, but had, in some odd way, anticipated. Advising clauses, parsing maritime law for holes the oars might exploit, and attending public functions where every smile was checked against a list. His nights were a different currency. They were filled with feverish sleep and dreams scented with sandalwood, candle wax, and the metallic tang that had shown up in the Orsian letters. One of the nights during that fortnight, they were taken on the Royal Hunt, a political display that doubled as a field exercise. The hunt was theater and also testing ground. Courtiers watched for courage and for faults. Emissaries measured a kingdom's mettle against a banquet of blood and sport. What the hunt revealed, bluntly and in a way that required no commentary, was the ferocity that lived in Alan. The king rode like a thing fixed to purpose. When a hunter misjudged a shot and a challenge flared between an Orsian lieutenant and one of the palace's younger guards, the confrontation might have become a blade show. Instead, it became something close to protection. Alan placed himself between Jude and the flash of anger, as if his body were a new kind of shield.
A man named Keith, broad-shouldered and sinewed, moved too quickly and landed his hand at Jude's shoulder in a manner that smelled of possessiveness. For the first time since the first label had been pinned to his chest, Jude felt the sharp discomfort of being physically judged. Alan's palm found his back, hard and immediate. "He is with me," the king said simply, and Keith, a man accustomed to reading rulership as permission, bowed and moved off. It was not only the protection that mattered, it was the way Alan's palm fit against Jude's spine, deliberate, not performative. The world around them kept practicing the fiction, but in that brief protective moment, something more honest unfolded, like a sentence that had finally found its subject. The intimacy that followed in the suite was small and careful. They returned early with stained boots and the smell of the field on their cloaks. Alan made no grand gestures. Instead, he put a small poultice to Jude's ankle where a thorn had left a scratch and sat near him as if proximity could be medicine. "You didn't have to be brave about it," Alan said, with the kind of harshness that was almost tenderness. "You could have refused the public. You could have said no." Jude's answer was a scholar's economy, facts direct. "I chose for a family. I chose because the ledger at home is reality." Alan's silence after that was not absence, but processing. He understood sacrifice in a political sense. He had not expected to meet one that smelled of lemon soap and worn paper. He did not try to romanticize the choice. He tried instead to hold it with respect. Weeks passed with that rhythm. First, the intimate guardrails, then the public performance. A small, genuine affection nested between them amidst the practiced lines. They learned each other's small domestic cues, the way Jude preferred his tea, the scar at Alan's wrist from a boyhood fall. The king liked words precise, and the scholar liked places where words made sense. Scent continued to operate like punctuation, Alan's sandalwood anchoring Jude's strips, Jude's own ash and ink presence sliding under everything like a thread. At the Founders' Gala, the slip that had been seeded in part by a private moment swelled into a public rupture. The kiss that had been a flourish deepened and left Jude bruised in a way that did not translate to skin alone. Alan's mouth was a place of policy before it was anything else. After that night, it was, for a moment, an admission. They tried to talk the morning after in the small privacy of the king's study. Words were blunt instruments. Alan began with an apology. "I allowed something to happen without telling you." Jude's response was the ache of someone who wants to be catalogued in truth, not used as a commodity in rumor. "You did not let me stand back," he said. "You shifted the performance into something else." Alan's near confession, "I think I've loved you," arrived like a dangerous, honest thing. It was both a relief and a transgression. For Jude, who catalogued emotions as items to trust or discard, the confession landed like an uncertain ledger entry. It might be true, it might be an overdrawn account. He chose circumspection, not flight. "I am not sure where the line is," he said, "between what we do for the kingdom and what we feel." Alan did not press. That word, "did not press," was a small mercy. Instead, he promised a rule: communicate. If any boundary was crossed, Jude would name it, and Alan would respond. It was not a cure, but it was an attempt at a framework. Scandal, however, has no patience for frameworks. Someone in the inner circles, somebody with an old grudge and a quicker pen than conscience, forgot that the king's reputation was itself a kind of currency. A pamphleteer's ink accused Jude of being a paid bride, of having sold her body for coin.
The narrative arced fast, from rumor to a full smear. The press claimed he had been bought. Partisans whispered that the king had been foolish. The Orzite demand intensified in tandem. Lord Stephen's letters shifted tone, no longer suggesting civility, but pressing. He suggested that without a public demonstration of binding, there would be no reason to honor the temporary arrangement any longer. He asked for proof that the engagement had substance, or he would invoke the clauses that gave him the right to seize grain as reparation. The council convened in emergency. Ministers argued like men who keep the wick of a city lit with other men's fears. Alan's mother navigated the room like someone who could count wins like stitches. Jude sat through the meeting feeling his central role solidify into a single binary. Either he performed something deeper or the kingdom bled. Beatrice's solution, when she offered it, was as elegant and brutal as a well-sharpened pen. The oars respect a clear sign, she told the council. If they see an unmistakable bond, they will not pursue the ledger. And a bond in what form? The chancellor asked. Stephen's terms had not been ambiguous. A proven mate is recognized by our customs. The bite, an act of mating, serves as a demonstration. He said it in the measured way of a man quoting precedent. He added, casually, it is decisive. The word bite moved through the room like wind before a storm. For some it was a tradition, for others a barbarism in the teeth of law. For Jude it was a private thing demanded in public. He thought of his patch behind his ear and the strip on his collarbone and imagined them as things to peel away. When Alan asked Jude to step aside into the royal antechamber after the meeting, Jude felt his hands go cold. They closed the door, and Alan stood with both hands braced on the table, as if the wood were a world to be supported. There is another way, Alan said, and named a dozen policies that could be pursued: loans, maritime guarantees, hiring mercenaries, options that would buy time at higher cost. But those are gambles. The oars will smell hesitation. Tell me what you want, Jude said. It was the kind of sentence he had learned to use, concise, request-shaped, and hard. Alan's face reconfigured around something private. I do not want you used, he said. I want you safe. But if proof is the only thing that will keep our people fed and our ships in our harbors, then I must know whether you would consider something that seals us in the only way they will accept. Jude's mind catalogued the alternatives like footnotes. There was the easy sovereignty of refusing, risking ships and grain. There was the quieter pragmatism of bargaining with the oars for different proof. And there was the act that some cultures held as ultimate proof. He thought of Toby's handwriting, of his father's back, and of the little ledger that kept their meals counted.
He imagined a future where the kitchens were full. He also imagined being bonded in a way that could not be undone. The mating bite, wild-worded in fiction, was in this world a cultural and biological knot. It would leave him with a mark on his flesh and a physiological tie he was told he would feel for the rest of his life. The law would treat that mark like a signature. Alan did not press. He said only, quietly, I will not force you. Jude's answer was deliberate. If this is my choice, he said, then I choose it for a reason. Which is? For the kingdom, for Toby, for the people who will go hungry if our ports are closed, for you. The last admission scraped in his throat. Alan's eyes sharpened, not with triumph, but with a terrible gratitude. He bowed his head for a moment, in a movement that might have been once a sworn vow in other lives. Then we will do this properly, he said. You will be free to stop at any moment. It will be done with consent and with witnesses. The day chosen for the demonstration was a morning made small by the presence of witnesses, a handful of ministers, a royal physician, an Orsian delegate, and Beatrice sitting with an expression that was all appraisal. Jude had Thomas by his side, and a small envelope from Toby tucked in his inner pocket like a talisman. They entered the throne room, which smelled of old oak and intent.
the sunlight in slanted bars across the floor. Jude's heartbeat had the cadence of a footnote. He felt the public wrap around him like a collar. Alan's hand brushed Jude's sleeve once before he turned and faced the assembly. He spoke in a voice that required no amplification. This demonstration is born from the necessity of feeding our people and protecting our ports. Jude is consenting. He will decide the moment at which this stops. A murmur ran through the witnesses. Stefan's expression was studiously neutral. Beatrice's fingers were folded. Jude stood where kings and supplicants had been measured and felt, with a shudder the tidal pull of being observed. He gave a single nod, a professional, brittle knot of consent. If he was to move his body into the proof, he wanted to be an active agent, however coerced the context had been. He would not be a passive thing in a ledger. Alan's mouth closed around Jude's neck in a shape that left Jude no illusions about pain. He felt the teeth break the skin, not a brokenness that was violent without purpose, but a sharpness that registered like a cut in a page. It hurt in a way that cut through analysis and lodged in him like a live fuse. There was an intensity of sensation, hot, metallic, the rush of blood, and a sudden chorus of scent that had been waiting like a tide. Jude felt his own pheromones spool outward, raw and unhidden, and then a strange, wild thing, a flood of Alan's presence that was not only smell, but an almost tactile knowledge, like the skin had become a map that both men could read.
It was not erotic in the way the pamphlets suggested. It was an act that combined pain with a promise, an animal proof offered in the light of law. The witnesses, trained in the customs or in statecraft, watched with the detachment of people who had to count the outcome rather than the sensation. When the bite ended, Jude clutched the nearest column and felt the world spin in a way that had nothing to do with dizziness and everything to do with chemical transference. His vision shimmered. The royal physician, an old man with hands of steadiness, brought a cooling cloth and spoke in soothing cadences. There was a fever that rose within Jude like a storm, sudden and bodily. His skin flushed, sweat bloomed at his temples, and a faint nausea washed through him. Alan's face had changed. The king, who had been measured, stood now with an expression of acute responsibility and a grief that tasted like an admission. He did not offer speeches. He stayed by Jude's side as the physician administered salves and herbs, protocols for what the court called bond sickness, the immediate physiological reaction to a mating bite. It was a known and dangerous thing. The body recalibrated and demanded attention. In the hours that followed, the treaty that the Orrs desired was signed. Stefan, satisfied by the demonstration and by the presence of witnesses, agreed to withdraw his immediate claims and to return the merchants to their harbors. It must be clear, the Orrs delegation insisted, that the bond demonstrated a credible union. The ledger closed for now. But the victory was thin. While the Orrs left satisfied and the ships stayed at bay, the press had a field day. Where the act had been framed by Alan and Jude as an act of voluntary sacrifice, anonymous scribes spun a different tale. Jude had sold himself for coin. The king had purchased a bride and staged proof. The pamphlets that had once suggested a paid engagement now screamed with harder language. Purchased mate, one wrote. King's bought foundling, another declared. The smear cut in a way wounds do, deep, shaped to cause infection. Jude felt the insult like a bruise under the skin. He had chosen the bite because he had decided to protect people he loved. Now the same act that had safeguarded the kingdom became evidence of his commodification. Beyond the personal shame lay political calculus. The council, which had only just celebrated a quick reprieve from the Orrs, turned cold in places.
Some ministers, ambitious men and women who feared the smell of anything that could be spun into weakness, began to whisper about unfitness, about whose interest the king was serving. Beatrice moved in the currents like a prow through water, smoothing where it mattered and cutting where she found rot. Not everyone liked her methods, not everyone understood her necessity. Jude, who had always catalogued emotion rather than surrendered to it, found his ledger filled with accusations he couldn't so easily correct.
He felt like a page in a book read by the wrong people. He had taken the bite of his own volition, but anonymity stripped volition from deeds. The scorn of the city felt like a physical thing. He wrote a letter in the early morning, hands shaking. It was not a manifesto. It was a short thing, an apology and a protection. He described a choice, defined with the kind of precise language he trusted, his reasons, his consent, the witnesses present. He also wrote what he knew would be the sharpest line, that he would remove himself if his presence endangered the realm more than it saved it. He sealed the letter, not out of cowardice, but as a weapon of last resort. If they could not be spared the smell of scandal, perhaps his absence would make the king safe. The letter was addressed to Alan. He left with a few coins, a tart I remembered he liked, and a determination that felt, to him, like a sacrament. He boarded a train in the gray light of early morning. The station smelled of coal and wet wool, a small world away from sandalwood and oak. Jude sat on a bench while engines sighed and people came and went in their own small orbits, and he watched the steam blur like the margins of an old map. He expected a heart that would break slowly. Instead, he felt a cold peacefulness. In the ledger, his sacrifice read clean. He would be the one who had been bought. That story would let Alan's throne remain intact. But the world had a way of refusing tidy endings. Alan did not let the letter sit unread for long. The game found him on the platform with the rain slanting in an angry thread. Alan's cloak was wet. His hair clung to his forehead. He had the look of someone who had removed a mask and been more naked than intended. When he saw Jude, he did not speak for a moment. His hands were not the precise instrument of policy. They trembled with a human urgency. "You cannot leave like this," Alan said finally. Jude looked at him in the rain and felt the air fill with the scent of sandalwood sharpened by water. "I can. I will. It will be safer." Alan knelt, an improbable thing for a king, and that action altered the geometry between them. He was up close then, eyes raw. "I would rather abdicate than lose you," he said simply. "I would trade titles and ceremonies for a morning with you who is whole." The sentence was the kind of surrender that had the force of law. Jude had catalogued many things in his head, rituals, clauses, the arithmetic of the household, but he had not accounted for the possibility that Alan would place himself on the line in words that intimate. "You cannot give me everything," Jude said. "You cannot promise the future." "I do not promise. I offer what I can. I will be present in whatever way you permit. I will fight for you at the council. I will stand where gossip would see me and make it harder to invent lies." Jude's resolve melted like snow on a ledger line. The rain made everything an exposure. The logic was both simple and profound. To flee was to allow a story to write itself. To stay was to claim their truth. He did not want to be the relic of a bargain. He wanted agency, however small, however contested. They returned to the palace in soaked silence. The court watched their return with a mixture of speculation and relief. Jude found himself at Alan's side in the council room the next day, not as a prop, but as someone who had chosen to be present.
The king, who had felt the tenors of rumor keenly, stood and addressed the assembled scribes and ministers. He spoke plainly, without courting his rhetorical flourishes. He named the facts, the oar's demand, the council's deliberations, the witnesses to Jude's consent, and Jude's reasons for choosing as he had. He offered, in a hand that was not theatrical, to be judged in the public eye for what he had done. "I will not let rumor silence what we did for the people," Allen said. "This man acted for more than his own interests. He acted for the grain of our people. If you would smear him, smear me as well. I will stand with him." There was the force of a ruler's protection in that moment, not the sharp edge of command, but the slow gravity of someone using his office to shield. Beatrice watched him with a satisfaction that was almost melted into the public good. She did not gloat. She had been willing to use people the way a chess player used pawns. Now she saw her strategy result in a different sort of victory, perhaps one that would transform a tactical victory into a moral capital for the court. Public opinion, capricious as it is, shifted. The pamphlets, once gleeful in their accusations, found their pages cooling. Some of the more rabid scribes were silenced by the king's directness, and when ministers gave credence to Allen's testimony, the narrative began to reframe. Jude's letter, found folded beneath pillows, was read aloud in sections, but with context. A man who had considered the cost and chose to act not for money, but for sustenance. The public's appetite for scandal diminished as the truth, blunt and visible, was presented. The wedding that followed was smaller than the palace had first expected. It did not require fireworks or imperial pageant. Instead, it was a legal, honest exchange, vows spoken in the presence of the city's clergy and a handful of witnesses, binding in the way the oars respected and the kingdom could not contest. Jude stepped into the ceremony still raw from the bite, skin healing along the seam where teeth had pierced. There was no fanfare that pretended the path here had been easy. They married with the weight of consequence between them. Life after the wedding was both quieter and more complicated than the fiction had allowed. They returned to their rooms with the settled, weary tenderness of people who hold hands over a wound. Jude's role in policy expanded. His voice was no longer the timid margin note, but a part of the central pages. He wrote clauses and sat in debates with the kind of authority he had never expected. People listened to the man who had once hid behind a patch. But the bite left traces that were not only physical. Bond sickness took its toll in the weeks after, fevered nights where Jude dreamed of numbers unwinding and saw Allen's face laced with the confusion of someone dealing with an intimacy, both bodily and political. There were days Jude felt a strange dizziness, an echo of the first hours after the bite, times when the world's edges blurred into Allen's presence so thoroughly that he had to step away and press his palms to a table to remember his own weight. The king's guilt was an ongoing thing. He moved through the daily tasks with a concern that bordered on obsession, checking Jude's comfort, negotiating with ministers in ways that shielded his mate from potential slights. It was not always graceful. Sometimes Allen's attempts to protect were clumsy, an overly sharp retort to a minister, a cold dismissal of a tradition that Jude valued, and those moments left scars that required repair. They argued in private about boundaries and power. They sat in the study late into the night and catalogued their grievances the way Jude used to annotate a text. Healing, they discovered, was not a single gesture, but a layered architecture of small acts, making tea for the other in exactly the way they preferred, allowing space when one needed solitude, agreeing on what parts of their intimacy would remain private. There were also small public gestures that mattered. Alan refusing to accept a nuance at the council that would have sidelined Jude from a debate. Jude offering a sharp correction in a maritime negotiation that saved a clause from becoming a weapon. One afternoon, when a sly counsellor attempted to use the marriage to insert a provision that might have undermined the very people the bite had been meant to protect, Jude stepped forward. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had once been an invisible footnote and now demanded to be read. This clause, he said, would give the merchant houses privileges that could be exploited to the detriment of the provinces we swore to protect. He laid out, in simple terms, an alternate drafting that maintained the security the kingdom needed while ensuring commoners would not be sacrificed in the ledger. The council, which had once regarded him as a novelty, listened. The clause was amended. It was a small victory, but to Jude it signaled something enormous, that his mind could shape policy in ways his patch had formerly shielded him from involvement. He was no longer only protection, he was an instrument of governance. Intimacy deepened in other forms than politics.
The scent rituals that had been initially choreographed became something softer, a strip of sandalwood tucked into collars before a long meeting. Alan leaving small notes with book recommendations, Jude learning to set the table for breakfast in a way that suited the king's quiet economy. They nested in a way that reconceptualized what being public mates could look like. Not grand declarations, but 1,000 tiny signposts of mutual regard. And then, slowly, the city changed. Where once Jude had been a figure of pity or suspicion, he began to be known as a partner to the king who thought and read and spoke plainly. People who had once gossiped found themselves observing instead the couple's generosity, Alan's quiet donations to a strike fund, Jude's visits to the docks at odd hours to oversee grain distribution. Beatrice, who had engineered the initial ruse, watched the pair with a satisfaction that was almost maternal in its rare warmth. She did not apologize for having chosen the path, but she did confess, once in a private corridor, that she admired the way a small man had been able to steady things she had only ever managed with steel. Years settled into them like a well-worn coat. They married not only in ceremony, but in the slow motions of daily life. They adopted, by will and by choice, small routines that built a family out of needs and affection. Toby visited often and found, to his delight, that the ledger at home was no longer the source of hunger it once had been. He would write letters filled with news about roosters and the baker and the neighbors. Jude would read them aloud, and Alan would listen, sometimes laughing aloud at a joke about debtors being more creative than criminals. Children arrived like surprises planned by fate and late-night calculation. They were not born as the kingdom's answer, but as private consequences of two people learning to stitch together different languages. Fatherhood and parenthood rewired the palace. Alan discovered how to perform authority with a child leaning into his knee. Jude learned how a bedtime story lacking footnotes could be the best kind of law. Their home, which had once been a set of rooms kept for the display of power, became filled with objects that registered small domesticities: a child's shoe tucked under a chair, a stack of maps with scribbles in the margins where a young hand had tried to draw sea monsters, the scent of coffee and burnt toast mingling with sandalwood. There were still hard days. The memory of the bite remained a line in Jude's body that sometimes ached in damp weather, and occasionally a minister's cold glance would remind them that the court could be ruthless. Alan had to relearn the language of trust sometimes. There were moments when his instinct was to control rather than respect. Jude had to forgive, not because the other asked, but because he saw the king's attempts at change as sincere. They argued without grand gestures, and repaired with acts that carried weight.
In the end, what carried them through was less drama than repetition. The mundane acts of shared governance, the quiet rituals of scent and tea, the lived truth of a name spoken without fear. Jude, once invisible and then spectacularly exposed, found himself claimed in ways he had not hoped for, but now cherished. He listened to the city's rivers like margins of books, and learned, slowly and with a scholar's patience, how to annotate his life not solely in terms of loss, but in terms of growth. On a late spring morning, 5 years from the night he peeled his patch off for the first time, Jude stood in the palace kitchen with a child on his hip and a small apron tied around his waist. The sunlight came in like a promise. Alan was at the table, papers spread before him, and a cup of tea cooling only because he had forgotten it in the small flurry of attending a child. The child giggled and smacked a spoon against the table, sending a flurry of crumbs like punctuation in the air. Jude smelled the child's hair, a wild, honest scent that had nothing to do with politics or performance. He placed a soft kiss on the crown of the child's head, and then looked up at the king, whose hair had silvered at the temples in a pattern that made Jude's heart quicken with a fondness older than the kingdom. "You look domestic this morning," Alan said, the old dryness softened into something warm. Jude smiled. "I am, for now. The maps can wait." Alan folded the papers, stood, and crossed the small distance between them with the ease of long familiarity. He placed a hand at Jude's shoulder in the old way, precise, steady, a touch that had passed from armor to comfort. "We did a terrible job of letting you read peacefully once," he said, with a smile that carried a memory. "We both did terrible jobs of a great many things," Jude replied, "but we are learning." They laughed together, the sound a small private truce. The morning felt ordinary and therefore holy. A man with a child laughing on his hip, a king with paper-smudged fingers, and a scent that wove through them like a line of marginalia. Their public lives required occasional reminders of the past. Beatrice, older and straighter than ever, would still send a pointed note about a diplomatic route. Lord Stephen's hand had receded from the kingdom's ports, satisfied by the marriage and the treaty it had sealed, but his shadow remained a political memory. The press still wrote, sometimes cruelly, but their words no longer had the power to reshape a life once the life had been lived out in full. On the palace balcony that evening, with the city spread like annotated text beneath them, Jude watched Alan settle an argument with a minister in a voice that had patience and gravity. Children's laughter, a companionable, domestic noise, rose from below.
Jude breathed in the air, sandalwood, lemon soap, the faint iron scent of distant trade. He thought of the first night at the solstice ball, when he had only wanted a cup of wine and a book. He had come to drink in peace. Instead, he had been thrust into war, into politics, into the sting of public shame and the heat of intimate proofs. He had found, precariously, and then with more certainty, a place from which to live and love. Alan, sensing his gaze, turned and took Jude's hand. His thumb rubbed the scar at Jude's throat once, a small and tender presence. "You chose," he said softly. "You chose to stay." Jude squeezed back. "We chose," he corrected, and the word included the sacrifices and the salvations, the bargains and the tenderness. It included Beatrice's hard hand and Thomas's steady service, Toby's letters and the city's uneasy forgiveness. Below them, the river cut the city like a line of ink. Above, the sky held a thin sliver of stars. Jude breathed in and tasted not just the past, but the possibility of a future that was messy and honest and human.
They had not come to the end of the world. They had come to a place where the world could be stewarded. In the quiet of the balcony, Jude felt the scent of the palace and the scent of his life settle into a single, complex thing. He had wanted only a drink and a book. He had been given